it has to be this way, otherwise people die.
It's a really important part of the journey is who you're on it with.
Honestly, part of it was pretty easy.
In health innovation, we sometimes talk about graveyard needs, the problems that so many teams have tried and failed to solve that they're seen as a red flag, areas to avoid, and maybe choose something easier. Ventilator-associated pneumonia, or VAP, is one of those problems. But today's guests, co-founders Kate Garrett and Dr. Dan Azagury, chose not to avoid the problem. Together, they took a graveyard need and reframed it. And along the way, the insight they uncovered became the foundation for Ciel, the company they built from a simple shift in perspective all the way to real ICU use. Today, Kate is now managing partner at Sonder Capital and associate director of Stanford's Biodesign Fellowship. And Dan is Stanford's chief of minimally invasive and bariatric surgery and director of the Stanford Biodesign Fellowship. Together, we dive into the story of revisiting a so-called unsolvable problem, reframing it in a way others hadn't, and building a partnership strong enough to carry an idea from insight to impact. Kate and Dan, thank you both so much for talking to me today. I'm really excited to explore your stories together.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're excited to be here.
I'm trying to figure out where the best way to start your stories might be. And since I think we'll be spending part of our time today talking about the company you two built together, I'd love to dive into what brought you to biodesign, where you started it. And Kate, you've spoken publicly about this personal dream or goal of helping 1 billion patients and through innovation. Was that on your mind already when you came to biodesign, or what drove the decision?
Well, it has always been a passion of mine to change the world in some way for the better, and really through healthcare specifically. Since I was in college, that has been an overarching goal and objective of mine. And so biodesign, I think, was definitely sort of in that vein. There was an aspect of it, but more specifically, I wanted to come to biodesign because I wanted to understand how you know what problems to work on. Like, what are the big problems, and how do you frame up it's exactly what biodesign is, right? How do you frame up the unmet need so that you can point yourselves in the right direction to go start solving from a technical engineering standpoint? And that was really driven from my personal experience as an R&D engineer in a startup company where I felt like the priorities would often change. It'd be like, okay, here's the most critical product we must have for our physicians, engineers, go fix this, work nights and weekends. And then it was like 90 days later, it'd be like, actually stop that project. Like, here's the most important thing. And so I just wanted to learn how do we figure out the problems to work on so that we can orient our resources, time, energy to having impact.
That makes a lot of sense. And I have a bunch of questions for you guys later about how you explore the problem and how you landed on the one that you did. But I'll put that in the background for now. Dan, I know you've had a global pathway towards biodesign, and you've spoken about sort of discovering the program accidentally on an internet search. How did you come to the program?
Yeah, you'll see that this is a recurring theme with Kate and I. Kate was already, 8 steps ahead, and she already had sort of this all sort of thought out and had a logic to, and how this fits into like the bigger picture. I'm much more of it's much more of incidental findings. Like I had my sort of path in healthcare and in surgery, and I loved innovation, and I loved creating things and designing things and thinking about why things didn't work the way they should be, or how could we make things better. But to me, it was always just a hobby. It was something where I had dabbled into it. I had done all the wrong things. I had some ideas. I went to a large company and said, "Hey, would you like to, work on this idea with me?" And they actually were extremely. It was a very positive experience. Worked with R&D engineers on a project for a while. Didn't go anywhere, but it was a very positive experience nonetheless. And as I was finishing my fellowship training in Boston, I, as you said, sort of stumbled upon biodesign, and it was like click. All of a sudden, these two things that I had no sort of grand vision or plan, like, clicked together. And it's like, wait a second, actually, this innovation itch could be a part of a career, um, and not something I had to keep as a side project. So that's how I discovered by design. The timeline was pretty short to apply, and got an application together and got an interview. And the bar was lower at the time to get in. So I got in.
Not true. I remember all the applicants there. I thought for sure I was never going to get in. There there were some really impressive people, Dan.
Oh yeah, I'm still traumatized. At the time, it was in-person interviews, and I remember this moment. Like, they book a hotel room for you, and you would walk into the room, and there was this physical booklet, the interview booklet that still is a PDF. There was this physical booklet sort of on this table, and first of all, I had never done a bio of myself before. That was the first time. And so I wasn't aware of how you should do it, like that was for the faculty to read, like, who am I? So and the booklet is in alphabetical order, and I'm first. And I see that my sort of hastily written thing about myself at the first person is there for all the candidates to see. So I'm already, um, my morale is already going downhill at that point. And then you start flipping pages, and you see all these incredibly accomplished people, and you're like, uh-oh, what am I doing here? So yeah, I was practically ready to not show up for interviews the next morning.
That's such a, I think, probably universal feeling, seeing that booklet and seeing how just shockingly accomplished everyone is. And I'll some not so subtle foreshadowing. I'll just mention to the audience. We'll come back to this later, but you two are both now the big bosses at Biodesign, so things have definitely come full circle in a lot of ways. Kate, you had kind of alluded to one of the compelling features of the fellowship being helping you develop your framework and sort of understand what you are going to be digging into and trying to solve. And you both had such an interesting approach to a sticky problem that I'd love to get into. But for starters, maybe you could sort of share what that problem is and what the story of a patient who was suffering from that problem looked like.
Yeah, the high level context is we were working on a clinical problem called ventilator-acquired pneumonia or ventilator-associated pneumonia, which by definition is pneumonia that occurs in a patient after 48 hours or more on a ventilator. And so that pneumonia is caused by the fact that they're on a ventilator, and specifically because to be on a ventilator, they place a tube into your throat and into your lungs, which holds open the epiglottis, or kind of the top of your lungs, and allows fluid to get into your lungs, which normally your vocal cords are closed unless you're speaking, and so fluid can't get in there. But because of the tools used for ventilation, it enables a pathway for aspiration or for fluid to get down there. And that fluid, when you're sick and in the ICU, it has bacteria in it. It can have stomach contents, and your lungs, which are normally a sterile area, can become overwhelmed by the bacteria that's now entering them and cause pneumonia. It's a big problem. It's one of the most common infections in the ICU. It can lead to 6 to 7 extra days in the ICU, broad spectrum antibiotics. It had a 10% associated mortality. So it was, you really don't want to get that. It was a big problem for these patients.
And a sticky problem that a lot of other companies had tried and failed, if I understand correctly.
Very persistent problem that had been known as a major issue in literature. I mean, Dan and I read hundreds of clinical articles going back decades and decades and decades that identified this as a problem. It was well known to be a problem. Many companies had tried to solve it. It had come up many times at Biodesign as an unmet need. in many years of fellows, I don't know, but it was a little bit of a joke, sort of how often ventilator-associated pneumonia came up as a unmet need in the fellowship.
I'm so curious because both of you, Kate as associate director of the fellowship now, and Dan as director, you both give a lot of advice and advise folks when they're maybe getting off the pathway or sort of helping people find their way forward. And it sounds like maybe you both ignored some well-intentioned advice along the way. Um, why did you ignore it? And how did you know it was the right thing to do?
Well, and again, this is intended to be advice for people. So, Dan and I are on faculty, and we, train students and fellows who are on their journey. And I always say, look, the point is to define an unmet need. And then are trying to, once you've defined the need and the criteria for success, then you're looking for solutions to solve it. And in that journey, you're looking for insights or particularly unique ways to look at these problems. A lot of the problems that come up, like we know about them. We've known for years. We just didn't have a way to either frame it, look at it, or technically solve it. And so, so I always advise to, it's great to have big problems and you try to characterize them, you define it. But if you don't have an insight or a technical approach to solve it, you hit kind of a red showstopper, right? Either we don't understand the pathophysiology, we don't have the technologies that can allow us to solve it within the constraints we defined. And when that happens, you take that unmet need and you put it on the metaphorical shelf. Like, this is a big problem that someday we're going to have an insight, something will change in what we're missing to solve this, and we're going to come back to it. And this has occurred time and time again in my career. And pneumonia, ventilator-acquired pneumonia, is one of those. Like, Dan and I had a really unique insight into the problem. Everybody knew it was a problem, but we and our team, we had a really unique insight that changed the framing, which allowed us to solve it in a different way for arguably the first time. And that was the differentiator. But they're real needs, and you might just park them for a while, but eventually you might come back or somebody else will solve it.
Yeah, I think the beauty of the advice that we give now is, in oftentimes, if you're an experienced clinician, for example, like, people will come to you for advice because you've seen this problem before, you've navigated this before, and you sort of have an answer. And the beauty of biodesign is that by definition, you don't have the answer. Like, if you had the answer, it would be a solved need. And the type of advice that you have to give, and I think that's also the advice that we were given, is like, people were saying, yes, we've seen this before. So it's sort of it doesn't mean that because people have seen it before that it's unsolvable, or that it just means you need to think about a way to solve this that would be different from what we've seen before, I guess. And I think that's what we did. That's what Kate describes with the insight. So I think the way that you mentor people for innovation is very different than the way that you mentor people otherwise. It's trying to give them advice about identifying the things you need to identify and identifying the roadblocks, and characterizing the need in the right way so that you're not missing something. You're not going to get, blindsided by something that's going to, hit you from the blind angle. But then people just have to go and find their way to tackle that and to answer that. And that's the fun part.
I'd love to unpack the insight, but maybe even a half step before that. Can either of you remember the moment that happened? Was it a eureka moment? Were you both in the same place? Were you in a room brainstorming, or did it just kind of gradually dawn on both of you?
What I remember is I had the opportunity to go shadow in the ICU for an emergency intubation. And for whatever reason, I was there. I got to go see this emergency intubation. And as a non-clinician, I was sitting there in the room. I mean, there are like 6 people. It was stressful. It was fast-paced. It was like, you're doing this. It was just like, there was a lot going on, and I could feel anxiety just in the room, like that this is, critical. And so I remember just thinking at the time, this is really stressful. Like, the idea of making a decision in this moment feels really hard. We should address the aspiration risk after intubation. But it was really based on like an emotional experience in the ICU and not much more informed than that. And that became the insight that became informed by a lot of stakeholder analysis and other hard work that we did. But at least initially, what framed why I started to think about it in a different way or ask different questions about when we should make this decision was simply because I was in the room and experiencing the intubation and just realizing how stressful and chaotic and challenging it was.
Yeah, I wish I could say it was this aha moment, but it's really it's like I don't know, like I feel like you're like paleontologist, and you like you're going with your little brush, and you're scraping and you're scraping and you're scraping, and after a while, like you have enough to be like, oh, this is an unknown dinosaur that we haven't seen before, but it takes a lot of little added points of data, providers, and it it ends up materializing, but in a very gradual way. At least that's my recollection of it.
Can you have a meaningful insight without being immersed clinically? And can you have a meaningful insight without spending time in there in person?
I don't think you can have a clinical insight if you are not close enough to the problem. Like I think you will open textbooks and or ask your favorite chatbot, and it can come up with problems, big problems. I think the insight typically will come from being close to the problem, and in particular, being close to patients. I've seen this over and over again where you see teams find an insight, and it's always something that was not the most evident aspect, but that patients knew. Like, and for our situation, it's not exactly the same, but I would say most of the time, it's really about being close enough to the problem to see the little details that other people's haven't seen.
I agree. I think that you have to get as close to the problem, the situation as possible. And I recognize how difficult it is for non-clinicians to have access to patient care. But I do really think it is critical to come up with the insight and the how the problem needs to be solved, because you have to understand the realities of what's going on today for all the stakeholders involved.
And I think that's a huge sort of link as you progress. Like you there's nothing more inherently personal than healthcare, right? And so I think even after you found the insight, and you know what the insight is, when you go and you pitch and you try to convince investors, or like a lot of the time it will be this sort of connection. It's like, oh yeah, my uncle had this problem and I saw it firsthand, and I can connect to this because I've seen sort of this quote unquote detail of the medical condition. Um, so I think the insight is important, not only because it gives you a way to solve it, but it also, if the insight is correct, I think other people involved with the issue will immediately connect with it, identify it as, yes, that is a real problem, and it will help you carry the project forward.
I love that. I think the fun part of innovation, and the part that sometimes people on the outside who are excited to get involved might think about, is the inventing part. And I would love if we could unpack a little bit more about the insight for those who may have heard this but missed what it was that was really an unlock for why all these other companies with devices weren't solving the problem. So I'm wondering if we could unpack the insight a little bit more, and then if we could trace that through to the device that you both invented and what that looked like and how it worked, and how all of that moved forward.
So I'm happy to tackle a little bit the insight. I think it's important to understand a little bit more about the problem to understand why the insight was so meaningful. But most patients who are intubated in the operating room, in the field, and then they end up in the ICU because something goes unplanned or there's an issue. And it's, again, only when you're in the ICU for an extended period of time that you become at risk for ventilator-acquired pneumonia. But the tube, which is really causing the problem and critical for providing ventilation so they can stay alive and breathe, is placed somewhere else. Most people who looked at this challenge of ventilator-acquired pneumonia said, the endotracheal tube is the problem. It's holding open the vocal cords. We need a better endotracheal tube. Let's make a balloon cuff on the tube that will seal the trachea so nothing actually gets into the lungs. Let's put suction in the endotracheal tube so that we can remove fluid. Let's cover it with silver so that we can reduce the bacteria count. There were a lot of really clever, bright ideas if you focused on the technology of the endotracheal tube that had been developed, that had been commercialized, that people had spent millions and millions of dollars on clinical data showing that they work. The fundamental problem is that it's a stakeholder issue. The tubes have to be placed outside of the ICU. These specialized tubes are more expensive. They are larger and stiffer and harder to place. And only a fraction of patients who have a tube placed actually end up in the ICU. But it's really difficult to know who's going to end up in the ICU. And so nobody wanted to blanket these more expensive, stiffer, larger tubes across all patients, knowing that only a fraction of them needed it. And so our insight, and again, informed by all of the people that had tried to solve this problem, right? Like we probably would have started with, let's improve the endotracheal tube, right? There's something already in there. It's easy. But when those failed commercially, Dan and I and our colleagues, really dug in to figure out why. And we understood this stakeholder challenge of tubes placed outside the ICU. The problem occurs in the ICU. Budgets aren't aligned. Incentives in terms of ease of use and et cetera aren't aligned. We need something that can be applied post-intubation selectively in the ICU just for the patients that need it when you know they need it. That was the fundamental insight. We needed to decouple our solution from the endotracheal tube itself. And it was really just as simple as that.
A big difference for a subtle change in the approach and timing. So you had this great unlock and insight that everyone else is blind to. What did it look like going from there to first device that you put in a patient? What needed to happen to connect all those dots in between? I'm sure it was pretty easy. It took a couple days.
I mean, honestly, part of it was pretty easy. Like the initial, at least, once you had that, this is not challenging technology. Like this was not a tech leap. This was, a iteration on, there are some concepts out there that work. They just don't work for this, with this discrepancy between stakeholders. So how do we make it work for the right stakeholders? So I would say the technology development was unusually fast and not underwhelming, but it was just like, okay, these are some of the things we could do. The implementation and sort of testing and this, like, you have the idea, but for the idea to actually work in a real patient, then there were a lot of iterations, and it's these very small tweaks and these very small bumps, and it's like trying to figure out what is the size of a trachea so we can prototype the right size. And I was like, nobody has ever measured that, because nobody needs to measure the size of a trachea across, men and women and small and tall and, and so it so happens that yeah, somebody did in the 60s measure the tracheas of some cadavers. And so you have a range to work with. But then, so there's a million little things that you need to sort of figure out and test, and it doesn't work and you test again. That's the part that at least takes a long time. And that's the part where you continue having surprises, and we'll get to some of those, but even late in the game.
I'd love to know what your dynamic was working with each other, because both of you individually have talked about finding this best friend in each other and a good foil for opposites and all of that. Did you guys ever have an argument when you were teammates, or never?
I I don't recall ever, like, we've had difficult conversations, and even the difficult conversations, I think we handled well. I don't think we've ever had an argument in the 15 years that we've known each other. Um, I truly found somebody that I deeply enjoy working with. And the more you get to know each other, the more you are able to understand how that sort of professional relationship works. And yes, we also became best friends. But it's a matter of, professionally, I think it was a matter of understanding each other's sort of MOs and glitches, and how, and there's a very nice sort of overlap of, my glitches are her zones of comfort, and, potentially vice versa. And you leverage that, and it's really amazing.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that we didn't have any fights because I could not remember any, but I was like, maybe I've glossed over this. And I would say it's one of my greatest joys of that experience is the friendship that Dan and I built. And I'm not saying that just to say it. Um, it's a really important part of the journey is who you're on it with and enjoying the journey. Like these are long roads. It is innovating in healthcare is not short or for the faint of heart. Like you got to enjoy the journey. And I think for Dan and I, and what I would encourage others to look for in the people that they found companies with, because I think what worked for us was two things. One, really a deep respect for each other's strengths and skill sets, which were different. We complemented each other. We don't have the same strengths or the same areas where we're not as strong. We always had this joke, like there'd be something that I would just be freaking out about, like so stressed out, like I don't know how we're going to solve this. This is going to kill the company. And Dan would be like, "Oh, really? Like I'm not worried about this at all. This is so solvable." And also vice versa, things that he would be like, "Oh my God." I'd just be like, "Oh, Dan, like don't worry. Like I could see a path to solving that." That was amazing. So one, a deep respect for each other's strengths and ideally that you balance each other. And two, just an inherent trust with each other, which Dan and I always had. And that's important when you have hard conversations, when you disagree with things, when you're trying to, work through, you need both, a respect for each other's strengths because you might defer to somebody in a certain area, even if you don't align. You're like, "Hey, well, I know this is your strength. I'm going to go with your opinion." And also just to trust that, like, I'm telling you exactly what I mean. And if you have those things, like, it's a very powerful combination.
Very well said. I think the trust is critical, and you know that the person you're working with has the right intentions, and you have the same sort of values and the same goals for, okay, look, this is ultimately, if you're talking about the company, you truly know that the other person has the best interest of the company in mind. And if you agree that that's the goal, then you can sort of digest and tolerate some of the things that are harder for you to, digest and go through, because it's like, okay, this is the right thing to do. We're aligned on that goal, and that being the North Star, and not, some other metric. So I think that the alignment of sort of values and the trust are incredibly important.
Mhm.
Could you both walk me through what it was like the first time you got to see your device in a patient?
So Dan and I had multiple products that we ultimately invented, and I remember the first use of all of them, and I was freaking out for the first two products, like beside myself, freaking out internally, trying to keep it cool on the outside. Um, so I don't know, Dan. Maybe I'm happy to share my version, but you should say what you remember.
To me, I will say, and this was, I refer back to Tom Crummell. Yeah, I have a little note from him that says, like, real innovation is a product in a box with a 1-800 number for sales and service. Like, whether it's a real product or a service, or it's a tangible thing. And he had sort of ingrained that. And to me, it wasn't even seeing it in a person, it was seeing it in that box. Like, I have this moment where we had it wasn't even a room, it was like a glorified closet with, like, the devices that were locked behind, because these were the ones that were for clinical use. And I remember, you know, seeing that for the first time with the boxes in the that were going to be shipped somewhere. That was that was an amazing feeling. That to me is like, that image is the one that's ingrained even before any patient use. The fact that something goes from your brain to this very tangible, um, real world thing it's pretty incredible.
Well, I remember this is again complementary skills. I remember our first product, we used one of our products at Stanford Hospital for our first in human. It was commercial, so it was available to be used anywhere. And again, we're in the ICU. These are critically ill patients. It's a very subdued environment, quiet, right? It's very serious. And we walk in to use our product to locate the endotracheal tube in the airway. And keep in mind, your airway is sensitive, right? You can get tickled, like you get something in your lungs that you don't want there. You're coughing. You're kind of like, so we used our product to measure the location of the tube inside the patient's airway, and they had a cough response. And I'm just sitting there thinking, oh my God, this is going terribly, like so terribly. And we walk out of the room, and the head of the ICU and Dan look at each other like, that was great. That was super easy. And I'm like, oh my God, really? Like it was just, yeah. So, but anyway, I was like, okay, great. You didn't need the context. You don't, it just, anyway.
Wow. And I've heard a rumor that a patient actually said thank you while the device was recently in use within seconds. Is that apocryphal, or did that happen?
That did happen. That was, so the main product again was focused on ventilator associated pneumonia. And we ended up with an embodiment of a device where we had a delivery device to advance a suction catheter to remove secretions that were in the airway, pooled in the airway. And yes, there was a patient. Patients who are on a ventilator are often sedated, but the range of sedation can vary from completely sedated and non-responsive to conscious sedation and able to talk and communicate. And we did. I was at working with a team to start using the product and do a pilot in their ICU. And the respiratory therapist used our product, removed a bunch of secretions, and actually had the patient mouth like thank you to them. And there were family members around who were just like, wow, I can tell how much more comfortable they are. Thank you. And it was, both the staff was like really happy to see that. And as somebody who had, been working on trying to bring the product to market for a while, it was very meaningful to see that patient impact, which you can't always see in the ICU because, again, a lot of times they're unconscious and not able to communicate.
Yeah. Oh, a lot of moments that must have really brought it home for both of you. I'd love to shift gears and take a step back and look at what this experience sort of did in terms of impacting what you both are doing now. Maybe Kate, if you could share in your work at Sunder, what your experience of growing and moving Ciel all the way through acquisition, how that informs what you do now.
Well, I think just like we were talking about, it's important to be in the clinic to see the patient experience, the clinician experience, to really understand what innovation is. Now I'm an investor and I, one, get to look at many people solving amazing problems and trying to approach them in different ways. So the Ciel experience informs and the biodesign training informs sort of understanding their unmet need and how they're approaching it, if that makes sense. But I think having gone through every step of the journey as an operator is really powerful when you move to the investing side because you've been in the CEO's shoes. You know all of the different pressures and forces at work, the trade-offs that you're making in decision making. You have resources that you can help your CEOs in terms of pointing them to experts, whether it be from regulatory, reimbursement, R&D, clinical strategy, commercialization. So the journey with Ciel, just having been able to see a product go from whiteboard concept all the way through to commercialization and patient impact, it informs every day of my current job because having lived that journey was really powerful.
Yeah, for me, I think it's a number of things. One is the fact that now sort of running the fellowship, it's a unwavering belief that the process works. It's like, look, I came in with sort of a passion and nothing more, and a clinical background, but no understanding of what it takes to bring a technology to life. And the process worked. Like I came in here, I was able to come out and, have this experience and take the company to, all the way. And that to me is sort of the ultimate proof that it works. If I can, if I can be taught that, then anybody can. So in terms of like teaching it, I really have this fundamental belief that we're teaching the right thing, right? Um, and then it also gave me this better understanding of what it takes to innovate in healthcare. And in a certain sense, I think as a physician, sometimes you come in thinking that it's actually harder than it is, although nobody's going to say it's easy, and it's a lot harder to innovate, I think, in healthcare than in other fields. But in a certain sense, I think as a physician, you're sort of trained, and David, you and I have talked about this a lot. Like you're trained in a way that is so rigid that you feel that medicine is this sort of this thing that can't move. It has to be this way, otherwise people die. And don't mess with it because you will kill people. And I think you and I have talked about med school, and I think you have shared this already that, I'm we've looked into how med school teaches medical students. And I have this fundamental belief that it's designed to yank creativity out of people. Like undergrads are creative. You go into med school, you're still creative, you're still asking questions. And then you come out of med school and you're like, nope, this is the way it is. And so I think to me, it just gave me the sense that, no, that's not the way it is. Like yes, part of it is the fruit of decades of research and understanding of the physiology, but a lot of it is also the making of other people before us. And so it just means that people are driving this and you can drive it in a different direction. So it gave me a sort of intellectual flexibility to think about problems in a way that is much less constrained, and even clinical problems. Like like innovation within my field in obesity and new medications is like, well, you sort of have this embracing of innovation rather than this sort of initial knee-jerk reaction of, wait a second, no, this is going to change something that's established. The way that is established is good, change is bad. So it really reframed my thinking about about all of medicine in general.
Well, I'd love to touch on one final question that you just sort of alluded to, Dan. And for both of you, Dan, you'd said with medicine, you're seeing it sort of being driven, and that you as the observer can actually step in and help drive things. For folks who don't have the benefit of having both of you as mentors and advisors, and folks who aren't in a formal program, who may not even be in a part of the country where innovation is kind of in the drinking water already, how can someone get started on this journey, even if they don't know exactly what the journey is or even what the problem is that they want to devote themselves to?
Well, I think there are a couple of answers. One of them is apply to the program, like come to BioDesign. There are a lot of BioDesign programs across the country. Obviously, ours is the best, but but in all seriousness, this is something you can learn, and I think you do need a certain level of understanding and expertise to do this, just like any other job you would do. And there are ways to acquire some of that knowledge. And the other way is, you acquire by doing. And I think, sort of just jumping into it and starting to be part of innovation in any way, shape, or form. Start working in a startup company, or start um, being part of some more risky advanced development clinical trial. Or I think there are a lot of ways where you can sort of learn on the job, and then sort of go from there.
Yeah, I think there's small ways to start, right? And Dan talked about applying to the program, but you can also read the textbook. Just buy the textbook, or look at all of the online materials that BioDesign has and see if it's something, you're really enjoying learning and reading about. And I like his point about just start somewhere, just get involved, right? Volunteer at your local hospital. And you can learn a lot, even if you're a volunteer at an information desk. What do patients coming in with? What are their concerns? Where do they go? How are they feeling? You could get a job at a startup company, like Dan's saying, or really any company, could be a larger company in the healthcare field. If you're a clinician, I love Dan's idea about how can you find a clinical trial and proactively reach out and offer to be a site for them, or to do data review, or to help them write the paper, or, again, just like little ways to get to start to get involved, and then connections build on each other, and eventually, your career will blossom on an innovation side.
Wow. Well, Kate and Dan, thank you both so much for talking today. This has been such a special conversation.
Thanks for having us. It was really
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. Thanks, David.